Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special Roundtable event to celebrate the release of the Halo Encyclopedia. Yes, indeed, we've got a brand new 2022 edition of the Halo Encyclopedia that definitively covers over 20 years of Halo fiction, releasing on April 13th. I'm Alex Wakeford, community writer at 343 Industries, and I'm joined today by three very special contender-class guests. We have with us franchise lead editor Jeremy Pattenoud, senior franchise narrative writer Jeff Easterling, and senior franchise writer Kenneth Peters. A very warm welcome to you three.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Alex.
And of course, before we get to the proceedings, I want to give a big shout out to our partners over at Dark Horse who are publishing the Halo Encyclopedia. Our cover artist, the inimitable Nicholas Barth-Bouvier, Scott Jobe, project lead on our consumer products team, and the incredible artists, illustrators, and other collaborators who contributed to making this the definitive exploration of the Halo universe that it is. So, to get things started then, naturally, I think the first question to address is why? Why have we decided to embark on this 488-page journey to create a new encyclopedia? What makes now the opportune time to do this?
Well, I'm probably going to speak to that a little bit. Let me first give props to Stephen Loftus, who is a part of the Halo community and who's been really just a great help to our team in terms of just verifying facts and data on objects. He really has served the Halo community well in not only his voice within the community, but also in the stuff he does for the team, 343. But to your question, this was an interesting one because over the last, I would say, decade or so, we've talked about doing an encyclopedia again. It's come up multiple times, but at certain points, there's been different projects that have kind of taken precedence. I think it was in 2018 when I floated this idea to Tiffany O'Brien at Consumer Products. We went back and forth about it. I think formally sent them a proposal showing them that I was really serious about it for the 20th anniversary, and they agreed to it at the end of 2019. But interestingly enough, like when the pandemic first broke early 2020, I was pretty confident. I was probably about 95% certain that we weren't going to be going through with this book for a variety of factors. But by spring, they were saying Dark Horse would like to, and our team would like to. So we went ahead and moved forward with it. And we're grateful for Consumer Products help and Dark Horse's work on there and all the people from the franchise team that helped out with this book.
That's amazing. I think that timeline really gives an idea of just how long some of these things take to kind of come together as well. And, I guess that leads to our next question is like, how do you even begin the process of making something like this? I've got to imagine that there were a lot of tricky questions you had to sort of answer from the beginning to get a sense of direction.
We've done enough of these books to have an understanding of how they can be approached in terms of material, in terms of content. I think from the very beginning, Jeff will remember this because he and I sat together in the studio when this was going on. I had a whiteboard up and we were looking at how we could divide content in this book in a way that was organic and natural, felt like it was being divided within the universe and not externally imposed outside of it or just, through the lens of humanity and their eyes in the UNSC. And we came up with basically we had a pagination that was built out and updated probably a bazillion times, but that divided the universe into factions. And this was different than we've done in the past. We did a little bit, I think with the Halo 4 visual guide, we divided up into larger sort of categories. But with previous guidebooks, sometimes we'll just either lean on the publisher for whatever they think is the best avenue to divide the content, or we'll just germinate an idea internally and roll with it. And with this particular book, we went with factions, which has a lot of really interesting positives and some drawbacks, but we think it was ultimately the best way to present the universe. So we divided it up into categories like humanity, covenant, forerunners, flood, and the banished. And we did that because you encounter those components sequentially as you move through the mediums of the stories that we have. And so we, instead of having it all from the perspective of Oni or having it all from the perspective of just some sort of UNSC, boots on the ground Marine, we wanted to do something that was a little bit more true to each individual faction. And some of that hopefully breathes in the content and in the flavors that we've got there. where it feels as though like when you're reading a given section on the Banished, you're not reading the UNSC's take on the Banished. You're really reading the Banished's take on the Banished. Obviously, pulling back a little bit from propaganda and stuff like that. But that was the main sort of focus. We wanted to have it divided by faction. There's redundancies that are introduced with that. Like you'll have weapons that appear across different factions. In the end, we thought it was the best way to show the content, especially when you're talking about 20 years worth of storytelling. There's just a lot there. And this seemed like the best way.
It's amazing too, just how much information there is for each of those factions now. It's not like any one is necessarily like massively shorter than the other. We've with 20 years of fiction, we've got so much on all these characters and events and everything. Just makes it a real treat to read. But the process of kind of wrangling all this together to make the magic happen, that itself must be its own kind of process. So what were some of the challenges there, like with supply chain print issues in the context of the COVID times in which we're living?
Yeah, there was a few issues. Overall, like the cost of a lot of things has gone up. Most people recognize that. Most consumers are aware of that. So even the cost of a page has gone up. Initially, we had talked about a little bit higher page count, but it panned out like this was the right page count for the overall product and for the cost point. There were other factors. I want to say, and Jeff and Ken should speak to this, I want to say that the actual production process on this, given all the technology that's available to us, like Teams and just calls that we can get on, was actually not impaired, I don't think, by this at all. I want to say that because, at least I'll speak from my perspective, like as a writer, I feel like it's kind of beneficial to be able to go in a corner and sort of just type and pull stuff together rather than, be in an office and have interruptions every 5 seconds. So I think to that end, that actually benefited the book. Although I will say that Jeff and I, towards the end of this process, had to get in the same room together to hash through and basically read every single word that was in the book out loud so that we could both hear it and make sure that it wasn't completely broken.
I am just picturing like a bunch of fan art of you two sat in very comfortable armchairs. You've got pipes in one hand and you're just, in a very posh fashion reading the whole section.
I wish it was like that.
It was
like 10 o'clock at night. Rings around your eyes.
Well, it's funny too, because we had some remote elements before the pandemic stuff because Ken was also offsite beforehand for some of that. So we were already from a sheer production in kind of in a rhythm of working remotely in a way and collaboratively on several of the elements. And to Jeremy's point, sometimes that's actually even more beneficial from a creative standpoint and a writing standpoint.
Yeah, I'll just point out that for a lot of the writing, I was actually at Budapest for the Paramount Plus show. And so I did a lot of the writing at Corda Studios. So I was on a different continent, 9-hour time difference. So.
Ken was dual wielding two different job flows.
And gosh, you're in Budapest as well. I mean, you got to appreciate that place while you're there.
Well, most of the times when I was writing, I was at Corda Studios, and usually when I was writing, it was when I had there was nothing that was on fire down on the stages. So
Ken had an armchair and a pipe.
Yeah,
It was Ken who had that. That was what you were envisioning, Alex.
the director's chair and a pipe.
Yes, I had my Hollywood clothes on.
So then, turning our attention to the encyclopedia itself and its content, let's talk about frame narratives, because here at 343, we love them. We've been doing them since the beginning, really, and we're doing one for this encyclopedia as well. Jeff, what can you say about this particular framing device that we've gone with and what it sort of means for the book?
Well, yeah, I'll speak a little bit, I think, to framing devices in general, and then have Jeremy talk a little bit about even specifically this one. It's something that, he and I had discussed as far as what might be a good fit. I think overall, in general, framing devices, they serve purposes that are both beneficial practically, but also narratively. And you're right, we do love them. We've had several instances of them. Mythos, which the three of us had worked on, also kind of was a framed narrative. And then also Kenneth worked really heavily on, kind of was the lead on the Spartan Field Manual as well, which in and of itself is a framed narrative. And in some ways, you could argue some of the novels even lean into that sometimes when you think of like Cryptum and the Born-Stellar relation, like the kind of role that the actual text plays in our universe. And I think, from a practical standpoint, that it helps you sometimes creatively with a little bit of safety net of unreliable narrator sometimes. But from a narrative context, it actually is helpful sometimes because it helps a product feel less immediately dated. And that is something that I think that's really particularly important for something like an encyclopedia, is because, it covers so much information, but because information kind of comes in so fast with new novels or new experiences and stuff these days, it can feel out of date more quickly sometimes. But I think giving it a frame narrative kind of helps time capsule it and make it a moment in time that can be appreciated for where it happens and when, as much as the content itself, which is cool. And again, I just personally like it because I like when a particular project or document feels like it is part of the universe. Halsey's Journal is a good example about, it's kind of a novel, but it's a frame narrative. It's a piece of lore in and of itself. And then Jeremy, if you want to talk a little bit about kind of like the angle we have taken with the encyclopedia specifically.
In like generally speaking, with regard to frame narratives and just framing any of the products we have, one of the questions we have to ask is this project going to look like it was, as people sort of survey and canvas, however long our sort of franchise, life is, will they look at it and say that was done at this point or that was done at this point? And how do you want those references to be? Do you want them to be internal within the lore? And this is one of those things where Jeff and I were talking about it back when I had that whiteboard up at the studio. And I was like, I don't know. I'm really not 100% certain if we want to go that route, because we went heavy there with mythos. But with some of like the visual guides and the last encyclopedia, like we didn't do that. I think ultimately what happened was, as we were sort of working through the content, it became clear that it needed a framing narrative and it needed some sort of contextualization around its place in the universe. And as we were talking through Halo Infinite and just the story and sort of where the story kind of ends up, it made a lot of sense for us to pull the trigger on a framing narrative that involved the Forerunners and got into some pretty deep lore, but was, at least for people who played Infinite, immediately recognizable and not something that they would need to parse. And there are obviously like flavors of detail that we've woven in that are for people who've been around and paying attention to Halo storytelling for a long time. But for the most part, we just wanted to have something that was clear and clean. Forerunner space is pretty easy for us to use as a framing narrative because the Forerunners are kind of this sort of omniscient force in the background. They were around, they have unlimited, ability to effectively to record data and to have all these narratives and stories and data, the facts of the universe, the nuts and bolts of the universe in their archives. And so that's where we ended up. It's I would say the least biased, even though you can't really do that when you're doing a framing narrative from, characters within the universe. The least biased of all the different factions that are sort of at play here. And so it made the most sense just objectively to go with them and to allow some of the coherency that I mentioned earlier, where you have, Banished and Flood and Forerunner and Covenant data that doesn't feel like it's a UNSC cipher that's giving us the information, or an ONI cipher, but it really feels like it was pulled from an archive that may have had a variety of different sources across history, but has a more neutral feeling and was created or developed from within the species or the faction that you're reading. So that was our overall thing. There's obviously a lot of different deeper, intricate things about that we could go into, but some of that might be good to keep as a surprise for the people who are reading it.
Indeed, of course, people who were fans of Spartan Ops and Halo Escalation and the sort of directions that those stories were headed will probably be quite happy, I think, with this. But I'm glad you mentioned the sort of the deep lore side of things, because the very deepest deep lore fans might recognize the name of the Auditor at the start of the encyclopedia. This is a forerunner who previously appeared in Somar the Painter, an exclusive short story in Halo Evolutions from back in 2009. That was a very
Way back
interesting
in the
choice,
day.
Jeremy. Way back in the day.
That choice was, I think, it was one of those late night conversations with Jeff as we're going through the final reviews, because a lot of the actual details of the framing narrative came after we wrote the content for the book. But that particular one, you were hinting at it with Escalation. There's the Insula from the Absolute Record is also involved in this. And I think the interplay there that we're trying to go with, and like I said, I won't give too much details, it's just basically we wanted to reward people who've been invested in this universe for a long time without, negatively impacting fans who may not know any of the characters we just talked about. So that's the balancing act that we're constantly trying to do. We're constantly trying to reward the fact that we have 20 years. And if you look at the last 10 years, it has increased exponentially from where it was the first 10 years, just 20 years of storytelling. We want to reward those fans, but we also want to make sure that every product to some degree is an opportunity for new fans to come on board without feeling like they're overwhelmed by the material. And so the framing narrative here, I think for this book, is a humble attempt to do that for a 488, page compendium of Halo storytelling.
Absolutely. And as we talk about, rewarding longtime fans, like as the series gets older, the sort of the years of investment that we're talking about for those fans, that too is increasing as well, which is a tricky tightrope to walk. But to that point as well, it's going to be quite tricky working with a franchise where a lot of things aren't necessarily visualized. They've existed solely, within the mind's eye of the reader for the books and stuff like that. So we visualize a lot of really cool new things in the encyclopedia, and we'll be releasing a few examples of those. Those of you on YouTube will see, I think, some example images pop up here. But what's the process that really kind of goes into visualizing these new things where it's really putting a definitive kind of staple on what those are?
First of all, it is just awesome. One of my favorite parts of the entire process, honestly, was getting to work with, folks on our amazing internal concept art team who were amazing, but then also got to work with external artists through Dark Horse and getting to kind of put all of our heads together and feel like, okay, what are the elements of this character, this vehicle, this setting that really speaks to the nature of a certain thing? And then how do we then convey that to the artist so that we equip them with the tools to create something that we feel will resonate and feel right in a way, using quote fingers, to fans that might have encountered these elements through different storytelling experiences, but also give the artists themselves kind of room to put a really unique stamp on things, especially for things that we haven't visualized, so that it gives it a flavor. And sometimes we would get a piece back and it was almost like it came alive and was a surprise even to us, to watch it come to life, which is really cool. Yeah. And I'd love to get Ken's thoughts on that as well, because he and I have had many long discussions over, things being visualized from different armor types in a game to elements from a book or from linear media and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it could definitely be a challenge as a writer because you have kind of a view of what this item is in your head. And then the artist has a view of what it is in their head. Then you have, in some cases, the original textual sources. That author had an idea in their head. And then the fans have an idea in their head. And so sometimes those don't always align. But yeah, it can be very cool when things do come together and you see the item actually realized. And you're like, oh, wow. Okay, no, that is what it actually looks like. And then it just becomes a really cool element of the universe once it actually becomes visualized. And I think it's partly because we're a video game franchise that having items actually be seen and drawn and illustrated is so important because we interact with these items in the actual game. So, and as, kind of looking out through through the periscope of Master Chief or Noble Six's helmet. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting process of trying to get everybody aligned and everybody kind of in the same headspace of what we're trying to get at when we when we visualize anything, whether it's an armor or a vehicle or a weapon.
And we're our team in particular is always aggressively pursuing opportunities to visualize anything that we can. Like we will make any excuse for an artist to be pulled off of something. Fortunately, in our situation here, like there was no overall impact to the studio. We were able to lean into external artists and internal artists between different cycles, and the stuff that came into this book. This was, if the three of us on the franchise team are constantly trying to work new art into the universe, or art, artification of an existing object or item, this was probably the biggest thing that we've ever done before, because there's so much new art in this book. So many things that have been undefined, things that fans have been aware of for 2 decades, but has never really been fully visualized, or things that have been visualized in like a comic book, or, described really detailed in a novel, but never ever, seen the light of day in terms of an art piece. And we worked hard to get as many of these as possible in the book. We weren't able to get, I don't think every single one that we wanted to, but we were able to get the major ones. And I think we're really happy with the way that they all turned out. And a lot of different styles too. Mm-hmm. There's some painterly ones. There's ones that feel more like a sort of comic book illustration, but overall, and then there's everything from visualizing planets like a Sangheili world like Ranello, which is in one short story, to visualizing weapons. And anywhere where we could, we really leaned heavy into trying to get things so that fans could see them, even if it was for the first time.
That's really exciting, because for some people, when they're just reading it in a book, they might have trouble picturing some of these things. And that's what makes this encyclopedia such a great companion to those experiences. Because if you have had trouble in any of the previous books, sort of like, oh, what does that quite look like? Maybe I can't tell. You get that with a lot of stuff now, and you can kind of go back almost with fresh eyes to that. Do we have any favorite new depictions of characters or settings or anything else that we've got in there? For me personally, my favorite one is the unhelmeted master builder image, which we've got. It's been a long time coming, I think, to see that.
That was a long time coming. That was an awesome piece. And we have a Born Stellar there as well, helmeted with an unhelmeted. We have inset images of both with and without helmets. But yeah, man, so many different things from the universe. And we work with different partners. Like we had external artists through Dark Horse in their relationships. And then we had internal artists like Jeff mentioned. And we even worked with folks from the community like Sins of the Prophets. We had a lot of opportunities to sort of work with different folks who are just really good at what they do.
Yeah, not only with the Sons of the Prophets folks helping provide some really amazing renders of ships and designs, but even working with kind of like artists who are names kind of in the old school Halo community, like Garrett Post or Levi Offmeyer, and getting them kind of back into the fold to lend their pencils and digital brushes to the book as well, to sit alongside all of the other amazing art. It's so hard to pick a favorite, because it'd be hard to pick a favorite in each category. I mean, getting to have the Audacity, the ship, visualized was really, really awesome. Getting to have a visualization, which we've actually shown, I think, in a cannon fodder for USA Zealous, and that was always like Ken and I have talked for years about wanting to figure out a way to get that old school like 1999 2000 elite armor back into the universe proper, and also a particular old school keeper of the domain was another thing that I am super jazzed about.
What could that be?
From a short story.
It is the only full page image, and we just love the image so much, and the content sort of worked around it. But that was the only in the book. It was the only image that basically took up 100% of the page. Yeah, because of just the size and the shape. It's great.
I think Ken too. I'd love to hear Ken's perspective. He's also worked a lot with like kind of the Sons of the Prophets guys, but also being able to provide perspective from like the military perspective on like tech for vehicles and weapons and things.
Yeah, and definitely my own personal interest is in ships. So every time we get to visualize a new dropship, a new frigate, a new cruiser, a new battleship, that is definitely the highlight of any project that I work on. So yeah, it was awesome to be able to get also the Sins of the Prophets folks in to get some designs visualized, and then obviously those will be in their mod. So that'll be actually playable, which is also super, super cool to see that, where it goes from illustration to actually gameplay is great.
So then, Ken, we can definitely confirm that some ships that maybe have existed in people's imaginations and only there for a long time, we might be safe to say that people will be satisfied with some of the stuff we're going to show off there.
Yeah, I'm hoping so.
Right.
And we actually had more ships visualized than we actually had the ability to put in the book. Some of those we've been putting on cannon fodder, for example.
Yes, indeed. So the encyclopedia has given us an opportunity to make some things clearer and more defined than maybe they have been previously. So, for example, ancient humanity, right? That could refer to a few different things in the past, and we've now managed to provide a bit more clarity on that terminology. We call them the ancestors now, right? So let's talk a bit about that and that whole process.
Yeah, that was actually something that I was super excited for us to be able to kind of add to the universe. And honestly, in some ways, it's a practical help, both for us internally, but also hopefully for fans too, because we absolutely understand that the Halo universe, especially its deeper lore and the Forerunner history and stuff like that, is the deeper end of the pool when you start to get into the Greg Bear stuff, for sure. And so we have even found sometimes that when you say ancient humanity, you already have to try to like self-delineate. Like, am I meaning, ancient humanity like post debasing, or was it actually the ones that could rival the Forerunners, et cetera? So we thought that the encyclopedia would be a good time. And we actually, honestly, we did this in a couple of different places. We used the encyclopedia to take advantage of a moment to kind of like redefine or additionally further define certain elements or certain terminology or nomenclature within the universe. And this is a great example of how we now, when we say ancient humanity, we're kind of basically going back from the debasing onward. So when you think of, Chakis and Riser and that path back for humanity, and when we say the ancestors, that's the more formalized term for the era of humanity that was more a direct peer and contemporary and even rival to the Forerunner civilization. Hopefully it helps fans and Halopedians out there to make an easier demarcation between those. But we've done a few different things in the encyclopedia to hopefully help with those kinds of things.
Yeah, and on the subject of humanity, looking sort of more to their modern incarnation in the Halo universe, we give a pretty comprehensive list of human colonies, along with their status, when they were founded, whether they've been glassed, attacked, destroyed, or if they remain untouched. Now, when franchise development so often requires a lot of open flexibility for any kind of story you might tell in the future, even on details that can seem so often just super minor, was putting pen to paper on that kind of thing for the encyclopedia quite a terrifying prospect to you?
Putting pen to paper on anything is terrifying. Yeah,
there's a lot of terrifying prospects. Alex, this is one of many nightmare-inducing scenarios. The thing about it is a lot of stuff was pulled directly from our internal wiki that we've been sort of building over the past, I'd say 5 or 6 years, aggressively infusing it with the lore from the last 20 years of storytelling. Really, Kenneth, this is kind of your baby here, because you had been putting together a colony list with some decent greebling and detail in some of the facts. And I think at some point I asked, can we publish this? And we didn't feel like there was any issue with it. Ken, did you recall this list right here that you've been working on in the library, right?
Yeah, there's actually a couple of lists that we were going back and actually just trying to document every single appearance of a certain category. So every single human corporation, including the ones that appear on signage on maps, every single, the colonies is another good one. And so that one, it was safe to publish, I think, because the colonies we were drawing from stuff that's pretty much already been published. But those are asks that have come up for a lot of our transmedia partners. It came up with asks for the Paramount Plus show, where people want to use colonies, and then we need to make sure that, wait, when was that colony glassed? Does that colony even exist? Is this a new one? What can we use an existing colony? And then we did have to add a few extra details or go back into the story Bible to pull out additional details, such as which star system these colonies are located in.
The satellites and all that. Yes.
Yeah, and how many satellites that they have, because that often is an important element when they get visualized in, for example, a commercial. How many moons are in the sky?
Mm-hmm.
If there's any satellites visible, does it have rings? What's the population? Is it an inner colony or is it an outer colony? What's the nearest colony? What source did it appear in? What page number? All those are different elements that we need to keep track of. Not all that end up in the encyclopedia, because that's not really relevant for that use case of just documenting these colonies. And it's not every single colony. So we still have additional flexibility, because there's tons of outer colonies that have never been named that we can call upon to for any narrative that we need. It's definitely an interesting process. I try to do the same thing with other categories. Ships is another one, because I have such an interest in ships. Going back and documenting every single named UNSC ship is something that we've also done, which some of that has actually made it into the encyclopedia as well. Every single class of ship. But the colonies is definitely really cool to finally get that into print. I'm sure the Halopedia folks will definitely appreciate having additional detail to fill out their categories. And for us, it's also good to be able to get that in print and be able to show our partners and kind of head off questions before they even get asked.
I think the curative side of the Halo fan base is really going to have their work cut out for them once they get their hands on this book. And another thing, of course, that we go into great detail about is the organizational structure of the UNSC. You've got the Marine Corps, the Air Force and Army, the Navy and ONI, the ODSTs. Ken, was writing that section a bit of a dream come true for you?
Well, I'm a former Marine, so I have a deep interest in kind of the how military forces are organized, but I also have a kind of an idea of, the UNSC is supposed to be a future composite military. It's not supposed to be the U.S. military in space as much as it has kind of ended up being that over the years, because that's the most readily available source of information is on the U.S. military. But also there was just lots of requirements from transmedia, the Paramount Plus show. We deal a lot with, we deal with a lot more with Marines and the other joint services. So it became important to actually document that and, to make sure they have logos, for example. Might surprise people that there was no actual UNSC Marine Corps logo in Halo canon. So those are things that we needed to create and document. But for me, it was also, we needed to have an authoritative source, an authoritative set of details that we could give our authors, for example, so that when they, when they use certain terminology in the military realm, those terms mean something very specific. When you say fire team versus squad, those are two different levels of infantry organization and different numbers of people and different roles. And sometimes that doesn't come across to, partners who don't have a military background. So part of this was just to systematize and document what's already existed in Halo canon and be able to provide that in a format that was easy to digest for our partners. And then just happened to ideally be in a format that was useful for things like the Encyclopedia and the Spartan Field Guide.
Just another thing that makes this the definitive Halo Encyclopedia that has yet been released. And one of my favorite periods of the Halo universe is the founding years of the Covenant, the conflict between the Sangheili and Sanshayum. It's such a colorful time in the Halo universe and hasn't really been touched upon in a lot of places beyond Broken Circle and other scattered fragments of lore. Might we learn a bit more about some of the key figures of that conflict in the encyclopedia, Jeremy?
Yes, you will. So when we were working on, I'm not going to give away too much, but when we were working on Mythos, even prior to that, there was a document that I was working on much in the same way that Kenneth was working on sort of the systematization of different, hard and fast objects in the universe, like colonies and like the structure of the UNSC. There was a story doc that eventually fed into Mythos a little bit, but we weren't able to pull all that information in there. And it was effectively taking the overarching narrative, which has details in pockets because we've told stories in certain areas like Broken Circle, for example, or Contact Harvest, but doesn't have a sort of robust understanding of all the different details of that time. Who were the leaders of the Sanshayum, for example, when they encountered the Sangheili? Who were the leaders when they left their own world? And so those are things that were kind of put down, not in a way that we have it's sort of our blue text, sort of pliable fiction thing. So we give ourselves some leeway on certain facts, and we write down other facts as sort of like set in stone. And in this case, these were kind of things that we had been toying with for a little bit. And just when we were publishing this book, we realized like this would be a perfect opportunity to talk about that, talk about the leaders in the Dreadnought when the Sanchayum were bombing Ulgathon or Sanghelios. And so there is some of that here. I mean, we don't give a ton of time to it because it's such a small sort of fringe component of the universe, but it is touched on in the book. And there's some details I think fans who've been, sort of parsing the Broken Circle timeline and other, deeper lore questions are going to enjoy having some answers for, and maybe some more questions asked, which is really fun to do as well.
Just picking up on a key word that you said there, Jeremy, fringe. It's been a little while, I think, since we heard about the Covenant fringe, civilizations that were encountered and exploited, but never fully assimilated by the Covenant.
I dropped that word for Jeff specifically.
I knew it.
I absolutely love the introduction to this concept in Halo Nightfall, and we've seen the Het appear a couple of times in some expanded universe material. Shout out to Kelly Gay on that front. But maybe there might be some new information here about some of these species.
Yeah, Jeremy wasn't lying. I love the Covenant fringe. I love the idea of it. I feel like there's more to explore there. And even in a post-war universe, I think that there's just really cool opportunities for storytelling there. And so we did get a chance to expand a little bit on some of the, a couple of species that you have heard about, again, things like the Yon-Het or even the Sharkoi, and kind of draw from some of their appearances in universe that fans have seen, but then go a little bit further and just kind of speak to their place in the storytelling. But it also gave us the opportunity to maybe expand the fringe just a little bit and give maybe a little bit of a peek behind the fact that there are more species that, we haven't talked about and maybe even more down the line. It would be nice. But that was really awesome, was a chance to kind of almost blue sky a little bit on what are some other elements that might be involved in this place that is, for all intents and purposes, a very, ancillary and tangential part of the universe. But it's also a spot that's really cool and gives the universe, I think, a lot of really interesting spice and flavor when you start to look at it. Not only the universe itself, but even when you think about like the Covenant as an empire, as an organization.
Absolutely. I think it's one of those, as you say, it's like a really small corner, but I think it really does make the universe feel so much bigger. And like there's so much more out there that you don't really know about.
Yeah.
I notice in my readings that we've gotten rid of the type designation for Covenant weapons and vehicles, going back to something that we talked about earlier.
Yes.
And I am sure that this was some matter of relief to you all. And we've also got a designation system for the Banished as well regarding their workshops. So what has gone into that decision, and how do we identify these things now?
More easily.
This is interesting because I remember conversations in the studio where there was certain folks who were like, we need to get rid of these things. They're just too confusing. They're not lining up properly. Part of the issue is we're inheriting a franchise. I say inheriting. I've been with the team for 13 years almost now, but it's older than that. And so there's a lot of things that were woven in at the very beginning that are really cool and interesting, but at certain points they may not have been maintained the way that that we would have liked them to, and so there's some inconsistencies, or there's just some areas where there's just a lot of detail where it's a bit confusing. And the type designations for Covenant material is one of those areas. And when folks would bring it up, this is confusing, or these don't add up, or they're supposed to be connected to the date that they were first seen, and there was just a lot of kind of dancing that we had to do around them. At some point, and I had been very staunch about, we can't get rid of this. This is the whole section of the universe. Stop talking to me about this. But at some point during the encyclopedia, I just realized that it would be more streamlined, especially given that the encyclopedia itself is designed to be this kind of internal monologue within each of the factions, not like humanity found X And now they're trying to interpret it, which is where the type designation came from, is how the UNSC sort of mapped and charted Covenant weapons. Well, what does that look like after the war when you've got Sangheili and humans working side by side in some of these areas? And so what it looks like is humanity actually getting on the same page as the Sangheili and as sort of the artisans that have built those weapons for the ages of the Covenant. And what they used is patterns. And so we delineate Covenant material with patterns, Banished material with the workshops that they're designed in, and sort of the kind of designs that come out of these larger Jirohanai workshops. I got worn down on this and we conceded eventually, but I think it actually is a really, really, really good sort of tie-in to where we are in the universe. We are not where we were when we were in the middle of the war. And fans are in a place where they recognize, okay, the war's been over for almost 10 years, if you're following like sort of in the infinite timeline. And so what would it look like then? Would we still define things by the same terms? And I think we just came to the conclusion that we would use more specific terminology and more terminology that is kind of innate to the faction that we're describing.
It also, I did wear him down. That was one of my proudest moments. I think it also speaks to the nature of like the creative process itself on these kinds of things, because, you know, the type designation did make sense, I think, at first. And it makes sense, you know, from when you have I think not necessarily a simpler, but just a smaller footprint of elements to keep track of. You know, when you're doing this stuff in Halo 1 and 2, and even maybe into 3, you're dealing with a narrower kind of band of chronology and also a smaller subset of appearances for these kinds of things. So I think it made it a little bit easier to work with that. But as the universe continues to go on, like, it wasn't necessarily set up to keep going for 20 years. And a lot of times it just kind of backs you into a corner sometimes where you're wanting to showcase the usage of certain things. And to Jeremy's point, you know, you have to dance around different stuff. But I think it does kind of speak to the fact that as a franchise evolves, sometimes you also evolve the storytelling approach and move or clarify certain things, adjust nomenclature, you know, stuff like that. And depending on what is good right now for the current, but also hopefully for the long term, and be prepared to make similar evolutions or adjustments in another 5 to 10 years. I mean, and even doing that with like what we did with the Banished terminology, like, hey, how can we differentiate that from the Covenant? Ken, I know, has also dealt with and always had really cool perspectives from a standpoint of like, you know, type designations for things, for material, for ship classes, for stuff, for patterns. And some of that even goes back to like design seeds with Forerunner tech and stuff.
Yeah, we definitely tried to be very deliberate about differentiating the different factions, not only in terms of, you know, the type and look of their equipment, but also, yeah, the designations of their equipment. What do they call it? Not what the UNSC or ONI calls it. It also, going back to what Jeremy and Jeff were saying, is as the franchise has expanded and evolved, and as the detail and number of assets has increased, the surface area of possible issues increases. And so this was also a way of helping us future-proof the content that we're making now going forward. The type designation is interesting as it was. It really only worked when there was a fairly small subset of items. And then once you go beyond that, it starts running into just problems all over the place. So unfortunately, it had to be sacrificed on the altar of franchise.
Well, isn't it lovely when these things align and they can just be quite straightforward? So something that I really love is how some of the descriptions in the encyclopedia hint at other completely separate stories going on in the universe. The Revenant's entry, for example, which was a vehicle from Halo Reach, mentions the youths of various species on Venezia using and modifying these vehicles for races. Paradigm's Loom is another very interesting bit of Forerunner lore as well, which I won't spoil here. Do we do these as sort of deliberate setups for future stories, or are they kind of more threadbare strands that simply may or may not be picked up on?
Yes.
Yes,
I knew you were going to say it.
questions. The thing about it is when we're writing this content, you don't want it to be dry and bland. You also don't want to create a bunch of problems for storytelling in the future. And so one of the things I think that all three of us have been trained to do, as we've had to do this many times over, is do our best to inject a kind of story content that is interesting and compelling, that is something we could lean into at some point in the future if we wanted to, but that can stand on its own, and it doesn't really interfere with other things that we're trying to do in the future. So, for example, Venezia's youth, different species sort of rolling these revenants around pod races or whatever. I want to say that was Kenneth, but like that kind of stuff is safe and compelling, and it adds a kind of texture to the universe that fans expect and anticipate, and that we as fans of Halo expect and anticipate. And so a lot of that is just our desire to make sure that the object you're reading isn't just this weapon shoots this many bullets, but has a history or a sort of a taste to it, a flavor to it that is compelling and feels like it's real. Like this is a real universe. This would have this kind of features would populate it and detail would populate it. So
it's a little bit of both, in that we are trying to create story seeds that we will actually develop in the future. And they're also just additional details that give life to the world and to the universe that isn't just bland technical descriptions. And we like it when stuff has a history behind it, and we know the fans like it when stuff has a history behind it. It makes it feel more real. It's more realized. It's more integrated into the whole tapestry of the Halo universe. But I will point out that some of those threads are there deliberately. I mean, we're not going to say specifically which ones are, but yeah, some of those are going to be developed in the future.
We're not going to make it easy for you.
Yeah, we're not going to spell it out necessarily, but there is a master plan behind some of those.
Ken and I worked specifically a lot on lore flavor text for things like, armor or weapons, maybe that you see in game in a customization tab or something like that. And that's another really good example of a place where you could just say, this is a heads-up display and it has a 3x times zoom. It's a little cooler if you can maybe attach it to like an in-universe manufacturer, or this was tested during this battle or something like, it just kind of creates a little bit of a value add that almost blends with a player's desire to kind of like role play or build their own kind of story in the universe even themselves. And some of the flavor that Jeremy and Ken had mentioned, it also gives us the opportunity to connect like some of those dots. So sometimes it's actual, a peripheral detail that connects to another peripheral detail. It doesn't always have to have a link to a big grand story. Sometimes it's like, oh, wait a second. I remember seeing this thing in this armor description that matches up with this cool little entry here in the encyclopedia. The more threads we weave, the tighter and more rich the overall tapestry becomes.
Yeah, and some of these threads, just to reiterate, Ken said, like some of these threads we do have an idea behind. Some of them we don't, but we still use them later. Or what we'll do is we'll have one of our authors will come to us and be like, or they'll have this written into an outline, and I'm like, this is an obscure detail. Like, how did you get this? And it just happens to be what they read about this specific vehicle or the specific environment. And it comes to play a pretty significant role in the story that they're telling. So some of these things, nothing is throwaway, I should say. At the end of the day, we tend to use all of these things at some point, or authors who are speaking into our universe and writing stories in our universe will grab onto them, even if they're really innocuous and seemingly like insignificant, and it'll turn into something really cool.
I think one of the key words really to pick up on there that we keep using is tapestry, right? Is that when you have an encyclopedia, I think a lot of people think, this is going to be like a fact file of information. And it's very much not what this is, right? It is this tapestry of all these interwoven stories across 100,000 years and beyond in this universe. And it's like zooming out to this very large painting. You get to like just check in on all these little details and everything, which hint at what's possibly going to come while covering what has happened. And so I guess that brings us to our final question here, which is that in Halo Infinite, we've teased the emergence of a new civilization, the Endless or Zalanin. Exciting stories to be told in the future, no doubt, with them. Do we get to learn maybe a little bit more about them from what limited information those Forerunner records have?
I would say that with the Encyclopedia specifically, and because of the timing of it, this goes along with the, Jeremy, I think, had mentioned it earlier. This goes along with the ever-present balance of the advantage of a transmedia type of franchise like Halo is that there are so many different avenues to tell stories. It is also the disadvantage because there are a lot of different places to find the story. And so sometimes it can be tough for fans when they're wanting to, chase down information on a thing. That we have to be especially careful with that with brand new things. So fans in the Encyclopedia can certainly expect some information about this emerging kind of element in the universe, but a lot of it is really reflecting kind of what the experience was in Halo Infinite specifically. Now, what I will say is that the advantage that this gives us is when you're playing the game, you're encountering this information in all sorts of different forms, even within the game. You're encountering it through narrative cutscenes and the campaign. You're encountering it through maybe audio logs and snippets and things like this, whereas the Encyclopedia actually gives us the opportunity to take a little bit more of a snapshot and help contextualize it and gather some of that information in an easier to digest way. I wouldn't want people to expect that they're going to find out all of these answers to mysteries and things like that. We still very, very much want not just the Endless, but several elements in our universe to remain mysterious and allow us for really cool storytelling opportunities later on in the future. But the Encyclopedia does give us a way to, again, kind of contextualize it in a new way and gather the information in hopefully a way that maybe sometimes is even easier to digest or clarify from what they experienced in the game.
Exciting stuff. Right. And well, with that, this roundtable comes to an end. And before I let Jeremy, Jeff, and Ken pass back into the domain, I want to say thank you very much for joining me today to talk about this absolutely incredible project. So for everyone else out there, do not forget that the Halo Encyclopedia releases April 13th. It has a deluxe edition, which features a fancy lithograph and a gorgeous case made in the image of a Forerunner Silex. Whether you're getting a physical copy for your coffee table or a digital one to peruse at your leisure, we hope you love diving into this absolute treasure trove of stories and lore spanning over 20 years of Halo history. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.